In this presentation, we discuss anti-forensics and their roles within digital forensics. Anti-forensics is defined as an approach to manipulate, erase, or obfuscate digital data and make it difficult to examine by making it time-consuming or impossible to do so. These are often used by criminals, and the aims are to prevent data from being recovered by law enforcement agencies and also to protect data from potential theft. The 6 most commonly used anti-forensics techniques are encryption, steganography, tunneling, onion routing, obfuscation, and spoofing. Firstly, we look at encryption. Encryption is the conversion of data into ciphertext. It is not an easily understood technique unless the individual has knowledge of how it works beforehand. Encryption starts with plain, readable text, and this is converted into ciphertext that cannot be read until this text has been deciphered. An example is Caesar cipher. This is a technique that replaces the original letter in the alphabet with another letter X numbers ahead. The cipher key is needed to decipher the encrypted text. This is the number of characters ahead that the original character is being replaced with. For example, if a cipher key of 7 was used, the word encryption would become an assortment of letters shown here. If the cipher key is not known, then the cipher text cannot be read. Algorithms are the sets of instructions used in accomplishing a certain task. There are 2 types, symmetric and anti-symmetric. Symmetric uses the same key to encrypt and decrypt the data, whereas anti-symmetric uses 2 different keys. The algorithm used is usually known, however, the keys are kept a secret to protect the data and prevent it from being deciphered. The processes are shown here. Key space. Key space is the set of all possible values that a particular algorithm allows. So an alphabetical cipher can have 26 values that correspond to the number of letters, as there are 26 letters in the alphabet. However, the key spaces are usually larger than this, as shown below, where a 128-bit key has a key space of 2 to the power of 128. The larger the key, the larger the key space. Brute force attacks. Brute force is the method that is used where every single possible combination of keys is used until the correct one is found in attempts to break the encryption and access the target data. Larger keys make this more difficult. Types of encryption. There are different types of encryption. These can be added to specific files, folders, or can be full disk encryption. Full disk encryption encrypts the space between the files as well as the files themselves. Most computers now come supplied with encryption tools. Windows computers come with BitLocker and Apple come with Firewall. Both of these offer strong encryption and full disk encryption. BitLocker files can be recovered if the computer is still running when it is discovered, and decryption occurs when the files are requested by the system. While with Firewall, users can store their encryption keys with Apple, and the data can potentially be recovered again if the necessary legal authority is given. Encryption is an issue within forensic investigations, especially as full disk encryption becomes more popular. However, investigators usually come across file-level encryption, which is easier to decrypt than full disk encryption, as if full disk encryption is used, it is more likely that it is not possible to retrieve and recover evidence, leading to difficulty within the prosecuting. Full disk encryption is overcome by investigators using multiple techniques, such as collecting all removable data and noting all passphrases. Both volatile and non-volatile data is also reserved from live systems, and the physical memory dumps and direct memory access tools are used, making it easier for evidence to be recovered and aiding in investigations and prosecutions.
Stenography. Stenography was first known to occur in 500 BC. However, to this day, it is now used in all contexts, not only digital crimes, and it's mainly used because encryption is relatively hard to detect these days, so digital criminals are trying to find clever ways to hide their crimes in plain sight. This includes them being embedded in banner ads, text messages, and images, and it's pretty much the digital equivalent of invisible ink. It can come in 5 different types: text, image, video, audio, and network. The type of stenography that hides things within natural text is called linguistic stenography. However, this is mainly used for information, not attacks, whereas there's coded stenography that can be used to cause attacks on computers. There are a number of apps that are very accessible that can be used for stenography, including StegHide and Stegius and Concealment. The example of stenography that I'm going to explain is of an image attack. So firstly, the specific target will be found and the criminals will find the best way to hack the network. And then a tool is installed. This is usually something like StegHide, as previously mentioned, onto the machine where a number of commands to copy an image file into the root of the directory, as well as into the text file that should be embedded into a particular image. So the file that contains the message will be called the carrier file, and the one that's embedded into the secret document is called the payload. The altered file will be created and renamed, and to verify that the two files are completely different by running them through a hash value command using something like PowerShell on each file, which will show 2 totally different hash values. Again, then using StegHide, a command will be run to extract the embedded data to a separate file, and once this has been extracted, the hackers can execute the payload and cause damage to the target. By hiding the payload within the image file, image stenography techniques can easily evade standard anti-malware, as they aren't designed to detect this. The reason why image files are usually used, and why I've used the image file as the example, is because they are large and they allow for good colour representation when using them for stenography. So the reasons why criminals will use this is so that they can hide malicious information within an innocent-looking file, and because the changes are so subtle, they can't be detected by the human eye. Stenography is also good because it's very time-consuming for machines to scan every image for hidden data, and also, as the threat's unknown, machines and investigators will not know what they're searching for either, so it will also take them a longer time. As criminals are well aware of the increased focus on encryption, they use things like stenography as it's a different way to make malicious software under the radar, especially in the context of stealing data. And lastly, it is easy to access for anyone, as there are free apps and DIY toolkits widely available online, so even amateurs can create an attack. Within detection, security analysts work to identify the tactics, techniques and procedures of attackers, as well as trying to identify their typical signatures that these applications use. This means that the antivirus applications that are put in place to prevent things like this happening can be created to identify these particular signatures. Tunneling. This method uses encapsulation to allow private communications to be exchanged over a public network. So the data appears as it's going from public network to public network, not generating any suspicion. However, it's actually private data passing through. One of the common ways of doing this is to use a virtual private network, or a VPN, which will encrypt the data. So this works by the data being broken down into smaller pieces called packets, which will move along the tunnel for transport. And these packets will move through the tunnel and they'll be encrypted and encapsulated, as previously mentioned. This means the private network data and the protocol information that goes with it are encapsulated in public network transmission units for sending. The units look like public data, allowing them to be transmitted across the internet, and encapsulation also allows the packets to arrive at their proper destination. And then at this destination, they'll be decapsulated and decrypted. There are 3 common types of protocol that are used, which are point-to-point tunneling protocol, secure socket, and IPsec. Criminals will use these protocols as they can hide complete packets, so there is potential for misuse of them. Tunneling's also often used to get past poorly configured firewalls by enclosing blocked protocols within the protocols that the firewall allows through. The use of tunneling protocols also makes it difficult to complete tasks such as deep packet inspection, where network infrastructure will look at the datagram for suspicious data to help ward off potential attacks. However, as they are unable to do this, they can just pass through the firewalls. And lastly, to eliminate these attacks, organisations will continuously monitor their encrypted network connections. They're mainly on the radar for networking or IT professionals who have to ensure their systems can block unwanted tunnels and have to apply by security protocols for data sent in using an unknown tunnel, for example, through a VPN. These tunnels can be prevented by firewalls and pattern matching techniques. However, as these have become less useful over the last 10 years due to better encryption, newer techniques are needed to be used. For example, using statistical traffic classification techniques that may look at things like unusual character sets.
So what is obfuscation? While obfuscation can be broadly defined as a process to make something less transparent or more difficult to understand by obscuring certain details, and by that definition it could supposedly broadly define all of the anti-forensic measures mentioned previously in this presentation. But outside of encryption, steganography and tunneling, there exists multiple other ways to privatise certain aspects of a program or file. Such techniques are often utilised by programmers for obscuring such things as trade secrets or specific algorithms or code of private or proprietary software. The purpose of obfuscation is that code has to be made either harder to access or harder to read, and the latter can be done either by overcomplicating the code or essentially muddying it up. A useful tool for digital forensics investigations is a decompiler, which allows compiled code or even an entire operating system to be deconstructed for more precise forensic analysis, and obfuscation makes it harder for these tools to perform effectively. However, an important distinction to make here is that obfuscation measures do not alter the content output by a program, but rather they impact the way it is either delivered, presented or accessed. A proprietary calculator program, for instance, should still output the answer 4 as the answer to 1 plus 3, whether or not obfuscation measures have been applied to its code or not. Another important consideration here is that obfuscation measures are harder in some languages than others, because languages like Java and C#, for instance, don't compile straight to machine code, which is harder to work with. Perhaps the simplest form of obfuscation is packing or compression, wherein programs can be compressed to make code more dense and harder to read, retaining only minimum functionality. Another easy way to make it harder to read code is by employing spaghetti logic, where code is essentially unstructured and unordered, perhaps even going so far as to remove any comments and naming conventions for variables and objects, which can greatly reduce the ease of reading. A further step to take here could be to swap out compiler instructions for equivalent instructions that are more complicated or convoluted, but effectively giving the same results. This would be like in our calculator application, swapping 1 plus 10 to get 11 with 1 plus 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 1. I think that's the same. Anyway, another technique here is which can be inserted randomly, like extra variables or operations that don't affect the result necessarily, perhaps by not being executed at all, and this strategy could also incorporate entire branches of operations known as opaque predicates, which are sort of logical Boolean true-false expressions, usually in the form of an if-else statement that don't impact the output again, but whose purpose is not clear upon external inspection. Essentially, a combination of these methods and others, paired with encryption or hashing mentioned before, can obscure details of files or proprietary software that can greatly delay forensic operations. So following from obfuscation, here we have some examples of code obfuscation in context. Well, firstly, we can see an instance of sort of instruction swapping to overcomplicate the process of variable swapping, which essentially reduces the readability of the instructions upon inspection. Then below this we have an example of an aspect of spaghetti logic, where the variables have had their convention following names changed to generic ones to obscure their purpose to external programmers. So next we'll cover some network-based anti-forensic measures, starting with spoofing. Now, in your internet using lifetime, you may have received an email or two from, say, your bank or a governmental organisation, or even a distant long-lost relative who also happens to be a Nigerian prince, who offers you a sizable investment opportunity, or a previously unknown connection to a vast inheritance, or with concern that your bank account has been hacked and that you need to confirm certain personal information to recover it from the evil infiltrators. Well, sorry to break it to you, but contrary to their lofty claims, most likely they are not who they say they are, and you have been a victim of spoofing. Well, spoofing is the act of disguising a communication from an unknown source as being from a known and trusted source, and it can apply to emails, phone calls, websites, or even be more technical, such as spoofing an IP address resolution protocol, or domain name system server. Tactics have commonly been seen in events such as man-in-the-middle attacks, where the sort of false actors will intervene in some kind of handshaking procedure where two systems communicate with each other to ensure that their private transaction to one another is confirmed and authenticated at both ends, and such an obfuscation of credentials over a network or email or phone call or even in person can complicate a digital forensic investigation, as effective spoofing can compromise the integrity of information needed for the investigation. Another way spoofing can impact forensics is if it occurs during an investigation itself, and if important files or reports or other such things are compromised, this could reduce the credibility of the evidence when needed for future reporting and in presentations in court. Fortunately, a disadvantage of this method is that effective spoofing is often heavily human dependent, because well-trained operators and programs can easily spot most spoofing attempts in emails, calls or other operations, and in most cases backtracking can be used to trace such things as IP addresses and other potentially false credentials, and extensive human-dependent security authorization methods can heavily reduce this risk in investigations. In summary, to the vulnerable and trained eye, spoofing can be an effective tool to get concerned users to give up sensitive personal information, especially if the actor uses big important names and logos like PayPal or Amazon, for instance, or a government organisation like HMRC, as well as corporate jargon or phrases that sound important, such as quotas of annual interest domains site-wide for QPR disassociative assurance that instill a sense of urgency. One such example is a call about an accident or injury that you've experienced in the past 1 to 5 years that you may not have received adequate compensation for. That sure sounds important and beneficial to the untrained ear. However, another particularly dangerous practice that could fool even more experienced users is file extension spoofing, as Windows by default will hide file extensions to users for better readability, which means a hacker could exploit this feature by obscuring their malicious software with a deceptive name like account_instructions.txt that appears to already show the file extension type in the name, when in fact it will represent an executable file, the extension of which will be often automatically obscured by Windows. So, examiners should exercise caution when handling sensitive systems, as extension spoofing can mislead reporting. One such example is that, say, a suspect user could create a spoof text file on their system that deletes all stored media when run, which could impede an investigation that considers such files as useful evidence. Fortunately, easy and common practices exist to reduce this risk during an investigation, like employing good security measures that can detect spoofs, like certain antivirus programs, or even just setting file extension visibility preferences on Windows or other relevant operating systems. So to continue on the subject of networks, VPNs and onion routing are two common ways that users obscure their activity on the internet, usually from their government or place of work or education, like a high school or university. A VPN combines two networking concepts: virtual networking, which enables users which are geographically distributed to use a network, and private networking, that enables private networks to incorporate data protection with guaranteed confidentiality among hosts on a virtual network, allowing trust relationships to be established and enforced on that network. This technology often utilizes the aforementioned tunneling strategy of encapsulation to ensure privacy and integrity, and this makes it difficult for other users to readily view the information being transferred. Whilst this can be considered a useful tool in an investigation to ensure communications with confidential parties are secure and private during an operation, the opposite can be said if perpetrators utilize VPNs to perform their criminal acts, which will resultantly be obscured. And finally, onion routing is a step above VPN, such that VPN providers are often bound by their country of operation, and as such still have to follow legislature for such things as taxes, network compliance, and in some cases, VPNs may be obligated to disclose sensitive usage analytics to governmental bodies or policing authorities if it is deemed necessary. However, the Tor browser, for example, along with other onion routing networks, are decentralized and not bound by national rules, and as such can ensure maximum privacy for their users, with measures such as end-to-end encryption into each of its layers, as well as automatic cookie and history erasure upon exiting. The core of the onion schema is that an array of nodes will relay a communication through multiple layers of encryption that are not decrypted until they reach the final destination. None of the other nodes are aware of the original source except the directly following or neighbouring node that receives the first instance of the message, and this is the case for each node, sort of like a game of grapevine in that aspect, where a message is whispered to an adjacent neighbour and the next neighbours aren't aware of the original content until it is obviously communicated to them in the same way. Now, Tor can provide a useful avenue of privacy for users who wish to communicate with complete anonymity, as it can open access for geologically restricted content and networks, which is especially useful in countries like China, for instance, that employ strict censorship protocols. However, criminals can also use Tor to circumvent a forensic examination, much like with VPNs, by performing any of their illegal actions with complete anonymity. In addition to this, if a user is chosen as an exit node, unknowingly, the traffic will be traced to their system and their system alone, which can throw examiners off the scent of the original source, when the exit node is the only source they have for the criminal activity. In conclusion, this has been Group 11's presentation regarding measures that can impede a digital forensics operation. The methods listed have ranged from altering aspects of messages, files, programs and code via obfuscation, encryption or steganography, and obfuscation of incriminating network activities via such methods as tunneling, VPNs or onion routing. And this list is not comprehensive, because as the digital industry gravitates towards cloud-based programs and privacy-ensuring practices online, the need for robust forensic practices continues to grow as spoofing attacks and protective networking grows more prevalent alongside means to protect criminal activity from being traced accurately. Thank you for listening.